The war was already over, or at least, that's what the world believed. But deep in the shadows of a shattered Europe, the last Nazi leaders were still hiding, desperate, armed, and ready to die before surrender. That's when General Patton called me in. He didn't shake my hand. He didn't waste a second. He just looked me straight in the eyes and gave me an order so ruthless, so unforgiving, that even now, decades later, it still keeps me awake at night. "Find them," he said. "Break them and bring them to me alive." What happened next wasn't in any official report. Because what we did during Operation Blackout was something no one was ever supposed to talk about. My name is James Walker, and I am going to tell you something that most history books buried under footnotes and forgotten filing cabinets. I was there. I was standing in that courtyard. I was one of the men who kicked that door in. I was part of the team that ripped the last remaining illusion of the Nazi Empire apart with our bare hands. This is the story of Operation Blackout. The orders that changed everything. Let me take you back to where it started for me personally. It was the second week of May, 1945. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Most of the boys I served alongside were celebrating, writing letters home, dreaming about steaks and cold beer and their mother's cooking. The nightmare, they said, was finally done. But General Patton had a different assignment for a select group of us. I was called into a briefing room that smelled of cigarette smoke and burnt coffee. The officer standing at the front of the room didn't waste a single word on pleasantries. He pointed at a map. He tapped a small coastal town near the Danish border, a town called Flensburg, and he said something that made every single jaw in that room drop. There is a Nazi government still operating up there. They are holding cabinet meetings. They are issuing government decrees. They are walking around in full military uniform, wearing their medals, saluting each other in the hallways. And they genuinely believe that we are going to recognize them as the legitimate ruling government of a new Germany. The room was completely silent for a long moment. Then somebody in the back said, quietly but clearly, "You have got to be kidding me." Nobody laughed. Because it wasn't funny. It was something far more complicated than funny. It was the kind of story that makes you question everything you thought you understood about the human capacity for self-deception. To understand what I walked into that morning in Flensburg, you need to understand how this phantom government even came to exist. When Adolf Hitler realized the end had arrived, when the Soviet Red Army was literally closing in on his underground bunker in Berlin, when the city above him was burning, when the Reich he had built on blood and lies was collapsing hour by hour, he dictated a final political testament. In it, he named Grand Admiral Karl Donitz as his successor. Not Himmler. Not Göring. Donitz. The commander of the German Navy. The man who masterminded the devastating U-boat campaigns that had terrorized Allied shipping across the Atlantic for years. Donitz was stationed far to the north, away from the chaos of the capital. When he received the news of his extraordinary promotion, he didn't hesitate for a single second. He moved his headquarters immediately to Flensburg, a small, beautiful, largely undamaged port city near the Danish border. A city that had somehow escaped the devastating Allied bombing raids that had turned most of Germany into a lunar landscape of ash and rubble. And in Flensburg, in the beautiful red brick buildings of the Marineschule, the German Naval Academy, Donitz assembled his cabinet. He brought in General Alfred Jodl, the chief of military operations. He brought in Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. He brought in General Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg. He surrounded himself with the surviving high command of the Third Reich, and he went to work. Now, to be completely fair, and I am always a man who tries to be fair, in the first week of May, this Flensburg government actually served a genuine, practical military purpose. Donitz used his authority to order the remaining German forces to surrender to the advancing British and American armies, deliberately steering millions of German soldiers away from the Soviets in the east. Many historians argue that this desperate maneuvering by Donitz likely saved hundreds of thousands of lives, both German and Soviet, by preventing weeks of additional pointless bloodshed. On May 7th and May 8th, representatives of the Flensburg government signed the documents of unconditional surrender. The Second World War in Europe was finished. The guns went silent from Norway to the Mediterranean. By every conceivable legal, moral, and international standard, the German government ceased to exist the moment that ink dried on those surrender papers. But Karl Donitz and his cabinet simply refused to accept reality. Instead of stepping down, instead of acknowledging the obvious truth, instead of at the very minimum having the basic human decency to feel shame, they went right back to work. Inside the Marienschule, the Flensburg government operated with extraordinary, almost comical formality. They held highly structured morning briefings, complete with precise military punctuality, officers standing at attention, orderlies bringing coffee on polished silver trays. They drafted lengthy, detailed memos regarding post-war agricultural policy, economic reconstruction plans, and civilian administrative procedures for a nation they had utterly destroyed and no longer controlled by any stretch of the imagination. They strictly enforced military discipline among the hundreds of German guards still stationed throughout the town, as if the war was merely on a temporary pause rather than permanently and catastrophically over. They walked the manicured lawns of the Naval Academy in pristine uniforms, their boots mirror-polished, their chests laden with gleaming medals and ribbons that represented campaigns and victories and a regime that the rest of the civilized world was still sorting through the wreckage of. And most incredibly, most breathtakingly, mind-bendingly incredibly, they genuinely, sincerely, completely believed that the United States and Great Britain were going to come to them and say, "You know what? We think we can work together." I need you to sit with that for a moment. These men had overseen the systematic murder of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children. Their regime had tortured, starved, gassed, and incinerated human beings on an industrial scale that the world had never seen and has mercifully never seen since. Their armies had swept across Europe, leaving a trail of devastation so total, so complete, that entire ancient cities were nothing but dust. And they thought they were going to be offered a diplomatic handshake. They thought their experience and expertise made them indispensable. They thought Winston Churchill and General Eisenhower would look past the concentration camps, look past the mass graves, look past the execution squads and the slave labor and the medical experiments on living human beings, and pragmatically recognize their value. The arrogance of this, the sheer, staggering, galaxy-brained arrogance of this, is something I have spent the rest of my life struggling to fully articulate. For 2 long, increasingly bizarre weeks, the Allies allowed this situation to continue. The British forces controlling the Flensburg area treated the German cabinet as a temporary administrative convenience. They needed someone with authority to help process the millions of surrendered German troops flooding in from every direction. The Flensburg government provided a useful organizational structure during an extraordinarily chaotic transitional period. So the British largely ignored them, using them as a tool while neither officially recognizing nor officially dissolving them. But this temporary patience, this pragmatic tolerance, gave the arrogant Nazi leaders exactly the wrong message. Every day they were not arrested, their delusion grew. Every morning they woke up in their comfortable quarters, put on their pressed uniforms, attended their formal meetings, and went to bed at night having not been handcuffed. Their confidence in their own indispensability grew stronger and more calcified. They began demanding formal diplomatic immunity. They began complaining to British officers about the quality of their food rations. They began sending official communications to Allied headquarters as though they were a recognized sovereign entity conducting legitimate intergovernmental correspondence. They interpreted British patience as Allied weakness. And in doing so, they made the single most catastrophic miscalculation of an entire career's worth of catastrophic miscalculations. The news of this phantom government operating freely reached the desk of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. And Eisenhower, a man I have admired with every fiber of my being from the moment I first understood what true military leadership looks like, was furious in a way that went far beyond ordinary professional anger. Eisenhower had recently toured the liberated concentration camps at Ohrdruf and Buchenwald. He had walked personally through those gates. He had stood in front of the mass graves. He had looked at the skeletal survivors, at the piles of bodies, at the industrialized machinery of extermination that the SS had constructed with the full knowledge and authorization of the German High Command. He had forced himself to look at all of it, deliberately, systematically, because he understood with absolute clarity that future generations would need credible eyewitness testimony from people of unimpeachable authority, because he knew even then that there would come a day when people would try to claim it never happened. After what Eisenhower had seen with his own eyes, the idea of Karl Donitz sipping fine wine and issuing government decrees in a comfortable naval academy in Flensburg was not merely absurd. It was an obscenity. Furthermore, the Soviet Union, our allies, however complicated that relationship already was, were growing deeply suspicious. Stalin was furious. The Russians were demanding to know why the Western powers were apparently allowing a reconstituted Nazi government to operate openly on their watch. Stalin accused the West of secretly preserving the German command structure as a future weapon against the Soviet Union. Eisenhower understood that every additional day the Flensburg circus continued was not just a moral failure, it was a strategic liability threatening to fracture the already fragile Allied coalition before the ink on the victory documents was even dry. The order came down. Shut it down. Immediately. Completely. Permanently. No negotiations. No diplomatic niceties. No recognition of any kind. On the morning of May 23, 1945, I was part of the task force assembled under American Major General Lowell W. Rooks, a hard, precise, completely no-nonsense commander who approached this mission with exactly the combination of cold professionalism and moral clarity that the moment demanded. The sky over Flensburg was brilliant and clear. It was the kind of beautiful morning that seems almost deliberately ironic, the kind of morning that belongs to fishing boats and open markets and children playing near the water, not to the final arrest of history's most monstrous regime. Inside the Naval Academy, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz and his senior officials were going about their morning routine as usual, dressed in their finest uniforms, finishing a morning briefing, discussing administrative policies for a nation that had ceased to exist 2 weeks prior. Then the sound reached them. Even inside those thick brick walls, you could not mistake it. The deep, unmistakable rumble of heavy armored vehicles moving in formation. The mechanical grinding of tank tracks on cobblestone streets. The sound of boots, hundreds and hundreds of boots, moving with military precision. A massive, overwhelming Allied task force, British tanks, armored cars, American infantry completely surrounded the Naval Academy from every direction simultaneously. There were no gaps. There were no escape routes. Every single exit was covered. I was part of the infantry cordon. My job was to hold the perimeter and ensure nobody walked out of those gates unescorted. I remember standing there, rifle in hand, watching the German guards inside the courtyard, men who had been standing at rigid, formal attention just minutes before, suddenly look at each other with the expression of people who have just realized that the ground beneath their feet is not solid after all. Allied troops with fixed bayonets stormed the courtyards. The German guards were disarmed immediately, their weapons taken before they had any opportunity to do anything other than stand there and blink in shock. Major General Rooks, accompanied by British and Soviet officers, marched directly into the headquarters. He sent a blunt, unambiguous message to Grand Admiral Donitz, General Jodl, and General Admiral von Friedeberg, "Pack your bags, you have 1 hour, report to my temporary office aboard the passenger ship Patria in the harbour." I was not in that room on the Patria. I have read the transcript so many times over the decades that I feel as though I was. When Donitz, Jodl, and von Friedeberg walked in, still wearing their long leather coats, their service caps adjusted with the precise vanity of men who have spent their entire careers obsessing over their own appearance, they apparently expected something resembling a formal, respectful dialogue between military officers. They expected, even at this final moment, to be treated as equals. Major General Rooks sat behind a simple table. No ceremony. No standing when they entered. No salute. Just a man with a piece of paper and a job to do. He looked at Donitz. He looked at the paper. Then he looked back at Donitz. "I am in receipt of instructions from General Eisenhower. He has directed me to inform you that he has decided to terminate the acting German government. You and all members of your cabinet are to be placed under arrest as prisoners of war." The words, by all accounts, landed like a physical blow. Donitz stood frozen. The grand, magnificent dream, the dream of being recognized as the legitimate leader of a rebuilt Germany, of being an indispensable partner to the Western powers in the coming confrontation with communism, of walking out of this war not as a criminal but as a statesman, evaporated in the space between one breath and the next. Any word from me would be superfluous, Donitz replied quietly. And there it was. The man who had commanded the entire German navy. The man Hitler had chosen as his successor. The man who had genuinely believed himself to be the president of a sovereign government just hours earlier. Reduced in a single sentence to a prisoner of war waiting to be told where to stand. Here is where I come back into this story personally. We had received intelligence, accurate as it turned out, that several of the Flensburg government officials were carrying concealed poison capsules. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS who had been captured separately just days before, had already proven how this played out. Himmler had bitten down on a cyanide capsule during a medical examination, choosing a coward's death over facing the justice that the world was preparing to deliver to him. Eisenhower was absolutely determined that this would not happen again. Not to these men. Not now. They were going to stand in the dock at Nuremberg. They were going to face the evidence. They were going to look at photographs of the camps and hear testimony from survivors. The entire world was going to watch, and the entire world was going to understand exactly what these men had done and exactly what they had been. So when Donitz, Jodl, and the rest of the cabinet were returned to the Naval Academy to collect their belongings, surrounded on every side by armed guards, the search teams moved in. The order was given. Take off your clothes. The ones who tried to run from justice during the search, the teams found exactly what they were looking for. Several of the officers had vials of cyanide hidden in the linings of their coats or secreted inside their luggage. Every single one was confiscated. But one man slipped through. General Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg managed to request a brief moment of privacy, a bathroom visit, the most ordinary and human of needs, before the full search of his person was completed. In that brief window, he managed to reach a capsule he had concealed on himself. He bit down on it. By the time anyone realized what had happened, he was on the floor. He died within minutes. I have tried, over the years, to feel some version of sympathy for von Friedeberg. He was in some respects less directly culpable than some of his colleagues for the worst atrocities of the regime. But I keep returning to the same truth. He chose to die rather than face the judgment of a fair court. He chose death over accountability. And in doing so, he told us everything we needed to know about whether he truly believed the things he had done were defensible. The rest of the Flensburg government was not afforded the same escape. I am an old man now as I write this. The boy who stood in that Flensburg courtyard with a rifle in his hands has been replaced by decades of ordinary life, a family, a career, the slow accumulation of normal human experience that the war interrupted and then, eventually, gave back to me. But I have never forgotten what I witnessed in Flensburg on May 23, 1945. I have never forgotten the absurdity of that phantom government, those men in their pressed uniforms, holding their morning meetings, drafting their agricultural policies, genuinely believing that the world would recognize their value. The colossal, almost incomprehensible gap between who they believed themselves to be and who they actually were. I have never forgotten the sound of those armored vehicles echoing through those peaceful streets. The moment those German guards looked at each other and understood, all at once, that the elaborate game was over. I have never forgotten the expression on Karl Donitz's face when Major General Rooks read him those words. The way a man's entire constructed reality can collapse in a single sentence. There was nothing behind the medals and the uniforms and the titles and the theatrical grandeur of the Third Reich but ordinary men who had made extraordinary choices to do monstrous things and who had then spent 12 years constructing elaborate psychological architecture to avoid facing what they had done. On May 23, 1945, that architecture came down. I was there. And I will tell you until my last breath, justice, when it finally arrives, is the most beautiful thing a human being can witness. If you made it to the end, then you understand this wasn't just war, it was about courage. Subscribe now for more real stories that history tried to forget. James Walker served with Allied forces in the European theatre from 1943 to 1945. He participated in Operation Blackout, the arrest of the Flensburg government, on May 23, 1945.